Are you looking at possibly moving to Post Falls, Idaho, and you want to know some pros and cons of living there? In this video, I will go over a few of the pros and cons of buying a home in Post Falls, Idaho. A pro for purchasing a home in Post Falls is its central location. If you work in Spokane or Coeur d'Alene, Post Falls is centrally located right in between those two. Also, with living in Post Falls, you are closer to Washington, so you can maybe find a better paying job over there, and you are closer to the Spokane International Airport. A question that we get asked often and can be a con is Northern Idaho affordable to live? And the short answer is no, it is not affordable to live. But it hasn't been affordable since 2018. A lot of that has to do with the cost of living tends to be higher, especially for housing and rent in this area. And that has gone up dramatically in the last 2 years. A con for purchasing a home in Post Falls, and something you just need to be aware of, is the majority of homes that are being built in Post Falls are on the Prairie Area. Now that could be a personal preference if you want to live on the prairie or not, but just know that when the winds come, you do get blowing snow, and the Prairie Area does get very windy. One of the cons of purchasing a home in Post Falls is keep an eye on your property taxes. Out of all the towns and cities in the area, aside from Spirit Lake, Post Falls tends to have the highest property taxes that I have seen. So when you're looking at purchasing a home, just make sure you are aware of what those property taxes are. Post Falls has a median household income of just over $62,000 a year, which seems to be the best actually in this area. Whereas their home prices for single family under 2 acres median is $511,000. One of the cons of purchasing in Post Falls too is the cost of living. Now, again, the overall cost of living for Idaho is 97.7. For Post Falls, it is 101.7. So it is slightly higher than the state, but out of the 4 towns that I've been talking about, it is actually the least in that. A pro for purchasing a home in Post Falls is, I would call Post Falls more of almost a bedroom community. People mostly live in Post Falls and then can commute to either Spokane or Coeur d'Alene to work. Post Falls is growing, and it's growing north. There are a lot of subdivisions and newer homes being built in Post Falls. So one of the pros is you have a little bit more options of purchasing in Post Falls, and the home prices tend to be a little bit better. If I'm looking at a median home for a single family under 2 acres in Post Falls, the median price right now is $511,000. Post Falls is growing, and it will continue to grow. Coeur d'Alene, for the most part, is landlocked, so everything is going through Post Falls and getting built up north. The population right now for Post Falls is just over 42,000 people, and that is the 9th most populated city in the state of Idaho. One of the cons of purchasing in Post Falls is there are a couple railroad tracks that run near Post Falls. There's one that runs through it, and there's a few that run above it. So if that is something that you don't want to purchase near a railroad track, just make sure when you're looking at property, you figure out which railroad track it is, how often it runs, and if it is still running. A con can be here recently, and I say probably within the last 5 or 6 years, because I don't remember it happening when we grow up, but in either August or September, when the wildfires are going, we tend to get unhealthy air. It just depends on how long it stays. This year, 2022, we had it for probably about 5 or 6 days, but I remember a couple years ago when it was out for almost 3 or 4 weeks of unhealthy air, to where kids couldn't go outside at school or be out there. So we do have those. It just depends on the year, how bad it is, and the wildfires that are around us. One of the pros of living in Post Falls is you are close to recreational. They have the Spokane River, which there are a couple beaches, public beaches that you can go to. They have the Avista Dam area where you can go and explore down in there. And it is closer to Spokane, so if you want to go over for a Chiefs hockey game or an Indians baseball game, you are closer and less driving than some of the other areas. This next one's a personal preference. I call it a pro, my husband calls it a con. So it all depends on what you prefer, but we do get snow. And depending on the year, we can get a fair amount of snow. Depending on others, we can not get a lot. It just really depends. I love a white Christmas, and I do remember a couple years ago that we were pushing up to Christmas and not any snow. But then we've also had February where we've gotten more snow than the state of Alaska. So right now the weather is just a little funky on what we get. I remember growing up in this area where there would be snow berms that were as tall as I was. We haven't seen that in a while, but that's not to say that it won't come back.